Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Actually, he's the head Viking. That's my great-uncle Othmar. We'll get back to him. Lovely to see you all here today. We're going to be talking about the Vikings. We're sailing where they sailed, and this is actually often referred to as the route of the Vikings. They're part of the world. But it occurs to me, it's lovely to see you all here, but sometimes it's good to get a clear understanding of the degree that someone who is presenting something to you is, shall we say, certified to be a presenter. And I had a very interesting come down relating to that a few years ago. My wife and I went to the Galapagos Islands about 15 years ago. Wonderful place. And among the marvelous wildlife there are two species of seabird. They're both called the boobies. There's the red-footed booby, who has bright red feet, which is a little surprising. And then, contrary to every reasonable expectation, there's the blue-footed booby, whose feet are really sky blue. And so I did what any good tourist will do. I got a shirt with the boobies embroidered right on the breast. And several years later, I was wearing that shirt on a cruise to South America, where the primary focus was penguins. And I was wearing my Galapagos shirt, and a woman came up and she said, "Isn't that cute? You have penguins on your shirt." And I said, "Oh no, those are boobies." And that pretty much establishes my virtue as an expert. We're talking about the Vikings, and when we start in a talk, we need to have a starting point. And in this talk, the starting point is a prayer. A furore nominorum liberas nos Domini. Latin. Of course, my Latin pronunciation is terrible. From the fury of the Northmen, spare us, O Lord. It was first heard on the 8th of June in the year 793, because out of the mists of the North Sea, a Viking fleet appeared and swept down on an English island off the northeast coast of England, an island known as Lindisfarne. There's a lovely monastery on that island. The Vikings came ashore, and as a contemporary writer put it, the ravages of heathen men frightfully destroyed God's great monastery in Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter. Plunder and slaughter indeed. That prayer began rising all across the coasts of Western Europe, from Scotland all the way to Sicily, as the Vikings came pouring out of the north, raiding and plundering all along those coastlines. A French monk, Abbo, wrote about them. "These wild beasts," he said, "roam through hills and fields, killing babies, fathers, sons, mothers." Churchmen thought this was the wrath of God. They thought this was a sign of the end of the world. The judgment day was coming. It was that bad. When we talk about something like the Vikings, an expression from an American philosopher in the 19th century, a folk philosopher named Josh Billings, always come to my mind. Josh Billings said, "The things that get us in trouble ain't the things we don't know. They're the things we do know that ain't so." Everybody knows a few things about the Vikings, and some of the things you know about the Vikings ain't so. And the first thing about the Vikings that ain't so is the name. Their victims call them the Northmen, the men of the North. They call themselves the Norse. Nobody said Viking. During the age of the Vikings, the word Viking did not exist. It first appears in the skaldic poems of the 13th century's Codex Regius, about 200 years after the Vikings were gone. We do not know the origin of the phrase. We do not know where the word Viking comes from. The best guess is that there's a Norse word, vik. It means, or it meant back then, an inlet or a port, and it still shows up today in place names. For example, Narvik in Norway, or the place we're going tomorrow, Reykjavik, or Wicklow in Ireland, or Berwick in Scotland. The Norse came raging down rather unexpectedly. Where did they come from? Go back to about 3000 BC. A people in western Siberia called the Samoyed. They were reindeer herders, relatively peaceful. Some of them left and went west across the northern tier of Europe into the Scandinavian area and settled there. And for about 1,500 years, they lived by themselves. They lived relatively quiet lives. But about 1500 BC, the Celts appear on the scene. The Celts are this mysterious people who sweep into Europe from where we're not sure, but they change everything. They change the people, they change the culture, they change the language, they bring with them the Indo-European languages that we all speak today. Some of them, along the south shore of the Baltic Sea, cross into Scandinavia, and they drive the Samoyed far, far to the north. The Samoyed are still there, relatively small numbers in the very northernmost reaches of Scandinavia. They call themselves today the Sami. Interestingly, when they were driven that far north, they took with them everything they had, except one thing that was left behind, and only left behind in Finland and Estonia, and that is their language. The Finns and Estonians do not speak an Indo-European language. Their language is called Ergo-Finnic. It comes from Siberia. It is the original Samoyed language, relatively unchanged. But these people, a Teutonic variant of the Celts, were good artisans, especially in amber. Amber is very plentiful along the shores of the Baltic. It's fossilized tree sap. And in the ancient world, it was greatly prized for jewelry because it had two fascinating aspects. One is that if it's properly worked, it seems to have an almost golden inner glow that shows through. And the second thing about amber is that it seems to have a magical quality. If you rub it, it'll then pick up little bits of lint or bits of paper which will cling to it. We know today that it's static electricity. We assume they didn't know that back in the ancient days, except the Greek word for amber is the word electron. So maybe they were onto it a bit. But in any case, the Greeks and then the Romans came north to trade for amber. They wanted it. And in doing this, they regularly opened up this area that far north, not only to trade, but to some degree of understanding between them and first the Greek civilization and then ancient Rome. In 300 BC, a Greek trader by the name of Pythias of Massalia. Massalia was a Greek colony in the Mediterranean. It is today the city of Marseille. He came north to get tin from Britain, but he also sailed on looking to find the source of these marvelous furs that could also be traded. And he sailed almost as far north as the Arctic ice, a place he named Ultima Thule. The Romans came. In 10 BC, Emperor Caesar Augustus sent a Roman fleet into the Baltic to map the coast of what he called Scania. And in 60 AD, the Emperor Nero sent a fleet to improve the charts. Even the very worst of men sometimes has a good quality here or there. In 100 AD, Tacitus, the Roman writer, wrote about people he called the Suetidi, the Swedes. He said they have a powerful fleet that controls the Baltic, and the ships are unusual because they have a prow at either end. He was describing early versions of what would be the Viking longboat. And in 550 AD, a man named Jordanus in Byzantium also wrote about these people of Scandinavia. He said, they are stronger in body and spirit than the Germans and taller than most people. Well, we know he was right about the height. Skeletons from that period show the average Scandinavian man was about 5'8" tall. And this was at a time when the average European man was about 5'2". But not everyone who had contact with them was universally praiseworthy. Ibn Fadlan, and a Muslim traveler, a representative of the great emir, the caliph in Baghdad, traded with Vikings along the Volga River in the year 920. And he wrote of them, "They are the most perfect physical specimens I have ever seen, taller than date palms, but they are the most physically disgusting people I have ever met. They do not wash their hands after natural functions, neither do they wash before eating." Another Muslim, al-Tartushi in Cordova, wrote of them, "I have never heard worse singing. It is the most terrible singing I've ever heard. It sounds like the growling of dogs, only more beastly than that." And Adam of Bremen, a German historian, wrote of them, "They wear the pelts of wild animals. And when they speak to one another, they don't use words. They just gnash their teeth at each other." But the Russian Primary Chronicle, and by the way, we'll have a little comment later about why Russia is important in all of this. The Russian Primary Chronicle, which is the oldest written history of the Russian people, dates back to the 8th century, says, "These huge, tangle-haired men are so rough and so wild that their very appearance denotes their bloodthirstiness. These men of huge frame and great courage know not defeat." And in combat, they didn't know defeat. They were extremely difficult to defeat, and one of the reasons was they did not fear death. To them, death was unimportant. What was important was the manner in which you died. In the Havamal saga, an early Norse saga, their great god Odin says, "All things die, men die. The one thing that never dies is the verdict on each dead man." Those who died disgracefully, those who died shamefully, were swept up by the goddess Hel and carried into the underworld. But those who died honorably, those who died courageously, those who died in battle, were gathered up by remarkable winged goddesses called the Valkyrie. The word Valkyrie in Norse means choosers of the dead. They would gather them up and carry them to Asgard, the garden of the gods, where they would be placed in Odin's great hall of Valhalla. It means the hall of the chosen. And they would spend all eternity there, feasting and fighting with other heroes. Death was very important to them, only in terms of the way in which they died. Of all the ancient pagan religions, only two still influence us in our lives today. One, of course, is the Greek, but the other is the Norse. And if you doubt it, just take a look at the days of the week. Saturday, Sunday, and Monday were named by the Romans for great god Saturn and for the sun and the moon. Tuesday is the day of Twi, the Norse god of war. Wednesday is Woden's day. Woden, the great god of intelligence and wisdom. Thursday, that's easy. Thor's day. Thor, the wielder of the great hammer of vengeance and of thunder. And Friday was the day of the goddess Freya, the goddess of fertility. And when we say those names, we're speaking Norse gods. Christian missionaries came into Scandinavia starting in the 9th century. And interestingly enough, they found almost no opposition to converting the Vikings from their pagan religion to Christianity. But when the Vikings converted, they converted their own way. They had another idea in mind, perhaps, than the missionaries might have thought. One Viking lord, about to be converted, learned that as part of the conversion, he would be given a relatively small piece of cloth. Cloth, he said. I have been baptized 20 times already, and every time I got a fine, long baptismal robe. This little piece of cloth isn't suitable for a dog. And another Viking lord, having just been converted, was asked, "What do you believe in now?" "I believe in my own strength." Very Viking. He had become a Christian, but he wasn't Christian at all. They did believe in their own strength. They loved to fight. They loved their weapons. And that brings us to the second interesting myth about the Vikings. The ultimate image of a Viking is the horned helmet. My great uncle had a horned helmet on in that first picture. If you want to draw a picture of a Viking, you draw a horned helmet. If you see a horned helmet, you know that it's a Viking. Well, we being today's civilization, several hundred Viking helmets recovered from graves, recovered from battlefields, and at least an equal number, if not more, images, contemporary images of Vikings wearing helmets. They all look like that. There are no horned helmets. No Viking ever wore one. They didn't exist at all. As a matter of fact, all the way down through the pathway of history, the only Vikings ever to go into combat with horned helmets are the Minnesota Vikings. And that's a fact. Why did they come? What brought them out of Scandinavia at that point in history to sweep down over Europe and then for 250 or 300 years to rule and then to disappear? We can't be sure. There are various theories. But I think the most reasonable theory was opportunity. Rome fell at the end of the 5th century AD. Several large kingdoms replaced the Roman colonies in various points for a time. But with the onset of the Dark Ages, all of these entities fell apart. Europe suddenly was nothing but these little fiefdoms, tiny little entities, I won't call them kingdoms, that were not strong enough to defend themselves even against the Viking raid. 1,000 Vikings couldn't plunder England if England had existed, but 1,000 Vikings could plunder Wessex or Sussex or Mercia, and they did. The Vikings saw an opportunity, a whole continent more or less unable to defend itself, and so they came. They swept down against Europe, and of course they did it by boat, which is a very fascinating comment. Go back to those years. Mariners sailed, but they never sailed out of sight of land. They used what we today call landmarks. A tree, a unique headland, interestingly shaped mountain. That's how they went from point to point. You never went out of sight of land, because if you were out of sight of land, you were hopelessly lost. There are no landmarks at sea. When you're at sea, everywhere looks the same. You need a method for navigation. The Vikings had it. It was a very simple little device. We call it a sunboard. Just a round disc of wood with a post, a small peg mounted in the center. And what the Vikings knew was, you use this to establish your latitude. They didn't know the word latitude. They didn't know that it was the distance from the equator to the pole. They didn't know there was a pole. They didn't know there was an equator. What they did know was that if you take a measurement on this and establish a position, day by day, you can sail a perfectly straight course. And so what they would do at noon every day, and they knew noon just because that was the point at which the sun was the highest in the sky, they would float this in a bowl of water, which meant that it was perfectly level. And they would measure the distance of the shadow that the sun cast. And with some relatively simple calculations, they could establish their latitude. And if they followed that line of latitude, they'd know they would sail a straight course from A to B. They sailed all the way across the Atlantic, from Norway to Canada, with Iceland and Greenland as stops along the way, just using this little device. 600 years later, the Arabs would invent the astrolabe, a rather sophisticated brass device that does the same job, somewhat more sophisticatedly. And that astrolabe began the great age of exploration. But the Vikings, who could neither read nor write, they had no written language, could do it in their head, just using a piece of wood. And they did. And the other thing they used was the longboat, a very sophisticated and rather elegant piece of marine technology. This is an actual Viking longboat in a museum in Norway. They were very elegant, long, graceful boats. Interestingly enough, they were very light, so light that they could sail across sandbars, into the mouths of rivers, into harbors. They could sail far up a river in order to raid. They could run a longboat right up on the beach, do what they had to do, and then just a few of them could easily launch it back to sea. But at the same time that it was very light, it was strong enough for the open ocean. The keel of every longboat was a single oak beam cut from the very center of the trunk of an oak tree in the shape of a T, magnificently strong, very flexible, and very light. And with this simple device and their sunboard, they could sail pretty much anywhere they wanted to. And this is what they did. They loved their boats. In Beowulf, the 8th century saga, there is a phrase where whoever wrote it says, "With billowy sail over breaking billows and with a foamy beak like a flying bird, the boat sped on." Whoever wrote that loved boats. The Vikings loved their boats. They decorated them magnificently. The stem post, the great post at the bow of the boat, was always carved, sometimes in a spiral, often with the head of an animal, a wolf perhaps, or a dragon, or some such figure. The stern post was also carved, usually in the form of a spiral. And on the stem board, the first board running down the front of the ship, they carved a fascinating creature. It was a standard image for the Vikings, and it's what we call today the intertwined beast. This is what it looked like. They put it on their boats. They put it in their brass and bronze weather vanes. The Vikings loved silver. This is a piece of Danish silver, and you can see the intertwined beast on the left side. Wings, claws. We don't know what it was supposed to be, but they greatly loved it. The Vikings also set up rune stones, stones marking a place or marking an event, and they had the intertwined beast on the rune stone also. They decorated their boats with that. Those of higher levels of stature had more elegant decoration. In the year 994, a Viking king by the name of Sven Forkbeard, I love some of the names, led a large fleet to invade England. And the ships in that fleet have been described to us. The observers said not only were the sides of every ship painted in every imaginable color, but figures in gold and in silver were mounted along their sides as well. On one side, golden lions. On the other, silver dragons belched out fire. Beauty was what beauty is. And now we get to the heart of this curious title, Carnage and Commerce. If the Vikings were just simply plunderers, just simply raiders, we wouldn't remember them today. They'd just be one of many tribes, peoples, countries that stole and raided and then disappeared without a trace. But the Vikings, for whatever reason, did two things. They would raid, they would steal, and then they would stay. And they would establish trade. They would establish trade routes. They would establish trading posts. And in doing this, significantly changed the very history of the countries they dealt with. Starting in the 9th century, they raided Ireland. Ireland in the 9th, 8th, 7th centuries was Christian, was very advanced in their religious attitudes, but there was not a single town in Ireland, nor a single port. There were, however, rich monasteries. And so the Vikings came, and they raided, but they stayed. They established ports for themselves where they could house their ships on the Irish coast. And those ports became the cities of Waterford, Wexford, Limerick, Cork, and the Irish capital, Dublin. Every one started as a Viking port. They established trade across the island of Ireland. They introduced coinage, silver coins. The words penny and market are Norse words. The Irish, from being relatively disorganized, under the Vikings, developed the beginnings of a modern economy. The same was true in England. In the end of the 9th century, the Danes conquered a large section of England north of the Thames. They called it the Danelaw. This was an area that was ruled by Danes. When Sven Forkbeard came, he landed in 994. Took him 19 years of almost constant warfare, but he established himself as the ruler of the Danelaw. He only lived a year, but his son, Knut, took over for him and ruled for 21 years. He ruled England, at least that part of it. He ruled Norway. He ruled Denmark. And they did the same thing in England that they had done in Ireland. They established trade. They established a road network. Words became part of the English language in England, place names especially. The word Chester in Norse meant a market. And so towns with the name Chester in them were dotted all across the landscape. Some of them still exist today. Winchester, Portchester, Colchester. The word by, B-Y, meant a village. Again, anything with B-Y in it was named by the Vikings. Whitby meant a village that was white. Crosby meant a crossroads. Saxby was a Saxon village. But the great irony of what the Vikings did, and they did it in many other places as well, which was to settle, to establish trade, to set up sophisticated commerce, to introduce coinage. All of these things strengthened the place where they were. They had been able to take it because it was weak. And in installing these modernized systems of trade, they gave it the basis of becoming strong. And as time passed, the conquered land became strong enough to ultimately push out the Vikings. It happened in England. By the beginning of the 11th century, the Saxons, the English native peoples, were growing strong enough to oppose the Vikings. Edward the Confessor, a Saxon lord, was named king in 1031. He would rule for 35 years. The story is that he disliked his wife so much that they never had children. Whatever the reason, when he died on the 6th of January, 1066, childless. The Saxons, now strong enough to do this, they felt, named another Saxon to be king, the richest Saxon lord, the Earl of Wessex, a man by the name of Harold Godwinson. And he became King Harold. But there were two claimants to the throne that would cause him a lot of trouble. One of them was a direct descendant of a Viking by the name of Gungu Hrolf. Gungu Hrolf means Hrolf the Walker. He was so big that no horse could carry him. In the year 911, he sailed a Viking fleet into the Seine River. settled along the lower Seine. The king of France at the time, and France at the time was much smaller than it is today, was Charles the Bald. Too weak to drive them out, he actually signed over the lower Seine Valley to Rolf, which included the city of Rouen. Rolf was baptized. He became Roland, Count of Rouen. And over the next 5 generations, his people expanded their holding out to the sea and off to the west. And over those 5 generations, his Northmen became Normans. And the place they lived became the Duchy of Normandy. And in 1066, the Duke of Normandy was the great-grandson of Rolf, a man by the name of, this is the Bayeux Tapestry. This is the only image we have of Harold Godwinson. But this is William of Normandy. And he said, I'm descended from Vikings. My great-great-great-great-grandfather was Roland, but his father was Forkbeard. And through Forkbeard, I have more right to the throne of England than this Godwinson does. And so he let it be known that he was coming to take the throne that was owed to him. And King Harold of England knew that he had a battle on his hands for which he prepared. But there was another claimant as well. And his name was Harold Hardrada. This is Harold Hardrada. Hardrada means hard ruler. In other words, Harold the Ruthless. He was born in Norway in 1015. When he was just 15 years old, he and his half-brother, Olaf the Stout, I love that, fought side by side against enemies to determine who would become the king of Norway. The place was the Battle of Stiklestad. They lost. And Hardrada, although only 15, left Norway, headed east, all the way east to the princedom of Prince Yaroslav of Kiev. He worked for Yaroslav of Kiev for a time, and then he went down the Dnieper River all the way to the Black Sea and across, because this was a standard trade route. And he became a commander in the Byzantine Varangian Guard. The Byzantines called the Vikings, who were in what is today Russia, Varangians. The word comes from the Norse word varar, meaning to pledge, because they pledged the value of the goods they traded. And so Hardrada worked for 15 years for the Byzantine emperor. But in 1045, word reached him that Norway was ripe for retaking. And so he went back. He led the forces that put his nephew Magnus on the throne of Norway. 2 years later, Magnus was killed falling from a horse. Hardrada became the king himself. And when 1066 arrived, and this question of who should be the king of England, Hardrada says, this William says he should be the king, this Harold says he should be the king, but I think I should be the king. He was descended from Forkbeard as well. And so he assembled a fleet, 300 Viking ships, and sailed for England. He landed at the mouth of the Humber River in northeast England, marched inland, and took over the city of York. Now, Harold Godwinson is in the south, preparing to deal with the invasion of William, when he hears that this other army, this Viking army, has landed in the north. He immediately moves his whole army on a forced march north. And on the 25th of September, 1066, they meet in what is one of the most important battles in all of English history, in all of European history. But it's a battle that has been completely forgotten because of what happens just 19 days later. It's the Battle of Stamford Bridge. And at Stamford Bridge, the Viking army faced off against the English army. The English army outnumbered it. They broke the line immediately and essentially slaughtered the Vikings and Hardrada. Hardrada was killed in the battle. It took them 300 ships to get there. It only took them 25 ships to get home. That's all they had left. But Harold Godwinson's army had suffered losses as well. And they had just made a forced march almost the entire north-south length of England. Now he turned them around and made a forced march south because William was waiting. And when they got south, on the 14th of October, 1066, the date all school children are taught, they met at Hastings. It was a fairly even fight. It went on for several hours with neither side showing an advantage until one of the Norman arrows struck Harold Godwinson in the visor, penetrated his eye, and killed him. The fight was over. William became the conqueror. William and his Normans assumed rule in England. And let us not forget, the Normans were 5 generations removed from being Vikings. So we have the Vikings still in control. And that happened in other areas of Europe as well. The trade back and forth between the rest of Europe and the Vikings in the north was at least as important, if not more important, than the fighting, than the raiding. Traders, Greek traders, Roman traders, Arab traders, routinely came north. They came north up the Dnieper River, up the Volga River, by sea. And they traded with the north for a variety of goods that they wanted. White bears, falcons, seal oil, eiderdown, iron, Swedish iron is very famous, honey, wax, malt, and of course, amber. And the Vikings had 2 towns that were their primary trading towns. One was in Denmark, at a place called Hedeby. Hedeby was on the base of the Jutland Peninsula facing into the Baltic Sea. It was there because a little river called the Slien flows from the center of Jutland into the sea at that point. Just a couple of miles from the headwaters of the Slien, there are also the headwaters of another river called the Train, which flows west into the North Sea. And so what you have is a kind of naturally made canal passage across the base of Jutland, up one river, a couple of miles of portage, and down the other. It eliminates the entire need for sailing all the way around. In 808, a Danish king, King Gotthold, built a combined wood-earthen barricade called the Danevirk, the Danish works, to protect this southern Denmark and this passageway from the wild Teutonic Germans to the south. The other unique Viking port was a town called Birka in Sweden. There's a large lake inland in Sweden called Lake Mälaren, and the town of Birka was on Lake Mälaren. Lake Mälaren empties itself out to the sea by flowing over a little 3-foot waterfall into a long 30-mile archipelago that is salt water. That waterfall was very important. It meant that if you sailed in from the sea, you could not sail up Lake Mälaren and reach Birka. It was a perfect natural fortification. Ships would load in Birka, come down to the waterfall, transload their goods to other ocean-going ships that waited below the waterfall. Conversely, ocean-going ships could come up to the waterfall, then transload their goods into lake boats that took it up to Birka. The point where all this transloading was going on was an island. It became a town. The Swedish word for island is holm. The town, of course, is Stockholm. Of all the goods that the Vikings traded, the 3 most valuable goods were fur, ivory, and slaves. Fur came from the north, that same Ultima Thule that Pythias had discovered in 300 BC. The quickest way to get the fur to the market was to load ships, sail them down past the west coast of Scandinavia into the Baltic to either Port A or Port B. And so this route became a standard route for merchants, and it became known as the Great North Way, this route down from the far north and into the Baltic. And over time, because it hugged the shoreline, the coast, alongside this route also became known as the Great North Way. And with time, of course, the land went from being the Great North Way to just being Norway. Ivory that the Vikings sold was primarily walrus ivory. They hunted the walrus in the Arctic, they collected the tusks and sold them, and they sold ivory by weight. Valuable, but only to a point. But the Vikings were nobody's fool. They also knew of another ivory that they could sell based not on weight, but based upon superstition. There is a kind of beluga whale, a small whale that lives in the Arctic, and it's known as the narwhal. Narwhal is Norse, it means corpse whale, because this whale likes to float just below the surface with its belly showing, and its belly is white. It looks like it's dead. And the narwhal has a very unique characteristic. The adult narwhal male grows a single, perfectly straight tusk out of the middle of its forehead, always spirally grooved with a right-hand turn. And it can be quite large. A 16-foot-long narwhal can have an 8-foot-long tusk. The Vikings would gather these when they could. And then when they sold them, they didn't sell them as ivory. They sold them as something unique and miraculous and special at a unique and miraculous and special price. They sold it as the horn of the unicorn for a very nice price. Slaves were important to the Vikings, like they were to most ancient peoples. They got slaves in battle, but the primary place they got slaves was from the great northern forests to the east of the Baltic. Norwegian and Danish Vikings went west to England and France and Scotland and all the way around the coast of Europe. Swedish Vikings went east to the end of the Baltic and then inland, where you had this great unbroken northern forest that went on seemingly forever. With a significant population of people, the people were Slavs. They were the Slavic peoples. And although there were a lot of them, they were disorganized. There was no country. So they were easily taken. And the Swedish Vikings would gather young men and young women. Some of them they would keep, and some of them they would sell as slaves. And as a matter of fact, our word slave comes from Slav. That's the origin of the term. This would be the primary source of slaves for Viking slave markets. Those Swedish Vikings that came into the eastern forests first established themselves in the latter part of the 8th century AD with little trading posts. They discovered that the great network of rivers that run across this landmass tend to run from north to south. And several of them, most notably the Dnieper, flow into the Black Sea. And from there, you can sail right across to Byzantium. And the Greek traders in Byzantium can sail right up to you. And so this, the Swedish Vikings settled along the Dnieper, as well as other rivers. The Slavic people had a name for these people. There is a Finnish word. Remember, Finnish is not an Indo-European language, but in their language, the word ryutsi means a Swede. The Slavs didn't get it quite right, but they called them the Rus. In the 9th century, a delegation of Slavic leaders came to the Rus, and they said to them, "We are a great people, but there is no order among us. Come and rule us." And the Swedish Vikings did. The first man to assume rule was a man named Rurik. He established a new town as his new capital called Novgorod, which means new town. It still does today. But because he was a Rus, the country that he established, and that grew from there and bigger as it occupied more and more land, came to be known as Russia. The word Russia comes from the Viking creation of the whole country. And the slaves played a part in the last of the Viking myths that I'll mention, which is the myth of the Viking funeral. You've seen it in movies or you've read about it in books. A Viking lord dies, he's placed on board his ship, He's surrounded by his possessions. He's dressed in his best armor with his best weapons around him. Depending upon how realistic the story is, some of his horses and cattle are slaughtered and put next to him, perhaps some of his slave girls as well. And then his ship is set on fire and pushed out to sea to romantically drift into the sunset, all ablaze. Didn't happen. It almost happened. When a Viking lord would die, a shallow trench was formed on the beach. His boat was drawn up into this trench. And then, dressed in his best armor with his favorite weapons around him, they would have several of his best horses, some of his cattle brought onto his boat and slaughtered. And they would indeed take several of his slave girls, the younger and the pretty ones, kill them, and then all together in that trench, the boat and all of its contents would be burned. But then the ashes in that trench would be gathered together, packed into a container of some sort, and buried. They had Viking cemeteries. This is a Viking grave, laid out in the shape of a boat. They loved their boats in life. They loved their boats in death. A Christian observer at one of these rituals was told by one of the Vikings, "You people put your lords in the ground to rot. We burn ours to give them immediate entrance to heaven." Which brings me to the end of this tale. It's a much longer story, obviously. We have tried to give you at least some understanding of who the Vikings were and why they were so memorable. I will speak again in a couple of days, and we're going to make a little change in our focus. We're talking about a subject not so much historical, but history-making, a subject that is on everybody's mind, and we're going to talk about it from one particular standpoint. We're going to talk about climate change. And what we're going to do is just look at the scientific information regarding how climate has changed, how climate is changing today, and try in some way to relate it to the current talk back and forth about climate change. That'll be in a couple of days. I'll take questions in a moment. Let me just point out, this story, earlier stories I have, are all recorded on CD. They're all gathered in albums. We have 16 albums from all around the world, more than 122 different lectures, and they're available in the Apropos shop if you're interested. We also have printouts, and take one if you'd like. They list all of the lectures we have available and all of the albums. If you're interested after the talk, stop by, take one, or you can check out Apropos shop and perhaps take me home with you if you'd like. Now, anyone have any questions about today or anything else? Ma'am?
Where did they get the idea for the dragons?
We don't know. The question is, why did the Vikings have dragons so prominent in their decoration? And not just the head of a dragon on a ship, but this intertwined beast, which is some kind of dragon-like creature. Where did this come from? We don't know. We don't know. They didn't have a written language, so they couldn't leave any detailed descriptions of all of this. And any attempt to unravel why that has been so important, it's on almost every rune stone they left. And as I say, their boats were all decorated with this. We have very beautiful Viking or Scandinavian silver that goes back for 1,000 years, and it's decorated with that as well. We don't know where it comes from. It looks very Oriental. When you first see this, you think, oh, this is Chinese or Thai or whatever. It's not. It's Scandinavian, but it's old. We don't know where it came from. Sir?
The Icelandic language, is that also based on the Vikings?
The Icelandic language is not based on, it is. The Icelandic language is Norse. Iceland was established by the Vikings about the year 950, and Iceland is fascinating for several reasons. For linguists, for those who like to study how language evolves, Icelandic is perfect because it's never been interspersed with anything else. English is almost impossible for a linguist because there have been so many different flows of language in and out of English. The pathway is very muddied. Icelandic is pure Old Norse. There's another thing about Iceland. It is not only fascinating for linguists, it's also fascinating for geneticists, because the Icelandic people have lived on that island relatively untouched by others. Relatively few people have ever immigrated in, very few people have ever immigrated out. So, and their records are continuous. Their first Congress on Iceland, the Althing, met more than 1,000 years ago. And it has been meeting in continuous meetings ever since. Their records are unbroken. So you can check out an Icelandic family, and you can go back 100 generations. And it's so easy to try and trace how various traits are inherited, how various traits are passed on or not passed on. And linguists use, not linguists, but geneticists use the Icelandic people as the perfect experimental population. They don't have to do anything to them. All they have to do is look at the history of their families. They see where everybody came from, and they see exactly who everybody is related to back for 1,000 years. So it's very useful. It's a fascinating place. Any other questions? Well, it's been my great pleasure. That lady who's waving is my wife. She's saying it's time enough, and she's right, because she runs me. Anyway, thank you all for coming. I hope to see you next time when we talk about climate change. Very interesting.